welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the Top Dog Talk podcast. I am co-host Harris Areno, alongside me co-host Dan Kiley. Dan, how are you doing today? 7:30 Tuesday evening.
I am emotionally drained today, mentally drained, but I am going to bring it for the show because we have a lot to talk about and an exciting show planned for you guys. So buckle up. Let's get started.
Let's get started real quick. The SEC Georgia's full 2023 schedule was announced today, Dan, at 7 o'clock, so about 32 minutes ago. Georgia's schedule is as follows. UT Martin at home, Ball State at home, South Carolina at home, UAB at home, at Auburn, home against Kentucky, at Vanderbilt, bye week, Florida, at home against Missouri, home against Ole Miss, at Tennessee, and at Georgia Tech. Off the bat, just off the cuff reactions. Dan, go.
A lot of home games, not a lot of great home games. You do get Kentucky at home. That'll be a fun game. Tennessee on the road at the end of the season. If Tennessee continues that trend where they're getting better, maybe that's an exciting game on the road. Doesn't really do anything for these people at home, though. Georgia has done a really good job of having a better schedule, a more enjoyable schedule. But last year's home schedule, this year's home schedule, and now that home schedule you read off for next year, not really enticing. I mean, you're not doing your fans a solid, Harrison.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the one home game that I'm really pumped up about, obviously Kentucky's always like a good matchup, but Ole Miss at home. Do you remember back in 2016 when they curb stomped? Sorry, guys. When they beat the crap out of Georgia, Kirby's first year. Do you remember that game? I mean, that game was absolutely insane.
Well, Ole Miss is always going to be fun because you have Lane Kiffin. Please don't go anywhere, Lane Kiffin. We love you.
It is definitely going to be a fun game to watch. I always love playing at Auburn. I always love seeing Georgia play at Auburn. Just because, I mean, Jordan Hare Stadium, nothing like it. They're going to have a new coach next year, guys. So it's going to be a whole new era down there. I don't think that's hot takey at all. We all see what's going on. But with that being said, we may come back to this. We may not. It sucks not to have OU in the second week of the season like we thought. Going down to Norman, Oklahoma to go play them would have been amazing, an amazing scene. But hopefully the SEC reschedules that game at a later date and lets us play them pretty soon. But with that being said, it is time for two hot topic questions of the week. Dan, first one up. Should head coaches be given a grace period? If so, how long before you can justify firing them?
Well, I think every situation is a little bit different, right? So, like with the Georgia Tech situation, we'll just use that because most people who follow the show are familiar with what happens over at Georgia Tech. They had a long way to go. They had so many things to overcome. Georgia has taken a death grip on the state of Georgia, and you're transitioning from a triple option offense. So the Georgia Tech situation, really different than, let's say, the Georgia situation when Kirby Smart came in. Mark Richt, when he was let go here at the University of Georgia, was winning 10 games a year. So Kirby Smart was brought in to elevate Georgia to that next level, meaning they expected better results than what Mark Richt was providing. Now, that first year was 8-5, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe that also includes the bowl win to get them to 8-5. So you could really say 7-5. Only 2 games above 500. Obviously there was a little bit of frustration, and there were so many people that loved Mark Richt that did not want to see Kirby Smart come in and take his job, that was just an option or an opportunity for them to jump on that bandwagon and say blah, blah, blah. But we have seen since that point, Kirby has recruited like a madman, which we'll discuss later, and he has built this program into what they expected, and he elevated it. So he had a shorter window than, say, somebody like Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech. Again, every situation is not the same, but you have to give a guy at least 2 or 3 seasons to see if he can get it turned around. Imagine if we instantly reacted to Mark Richt's or to Kirby Smart's first year replacing Mark Richt and fired him, then we wouldn't be living in the world that we're living in now. Look at what they did at Auburn, right? Harsin comes in, he gets the job. He wasn't a unanimous pick with the boosters of all people, right? So they tried to run him out of town. Now you have decapitated that guy and cut his legs off and his head off, and he's got no way to run that program. So you have to be very clear on the expectations and let your fan base know what the expectations are. Again, every situation is different. If a coach comes into a ready-made situation to win now, And if he doesn't do that, obviously he has a shorter leash. But if you have a complete rebuild, a tear down rebuild, you have to give him time. I think that they're giving Heupel up there at University of Tennessee an option or opportunity. I don't know why I keep saying option, an opportunity to build up that program. And I think it's trending upward. So I think in that instance, you have a right hire. Billy Napier down at Florida. It is not an instant win situation, despite what many people down in Florida want to believe it is. So you have to give that guy at least 2 or 3 years to find out what he really is and what he really can do. I think there's that knee-jerk reaction and instant gratification that so many people feel. And I believe so many coaches get the short leash when they don't necessarily deserve one.
I'm kind of in agreement with you too. I think you definitely need to give coaches more than just 2 years. I know there's no coming back from that loss of Penn State for Brian Harsin, especially when the boosters basically just tried to have a coup and almost won. They buried the guy in the media and in the public eye. They said all these things about him, which to me seemed like lies, or there is no confirmation to him. All these allegations about what he did, but just after one season, he almost beat Alabama in his first year as Auburn's head coach. And you have the audacity to go out there and trash the guy before he even really gets started. So my thing on this is, I think that you should at least give a coach 3 to 4 years of, okay, you get 3 to 4 years. That's one recruiting class. If you give a coach 4 years, that is one whole recruiting class they get to bring in and try and steer the direction of the program. Because if you don't see results in this first 3 to 4 years, you're not going to get the recruits that you want. I mean, go look at what Matt Rhule did at Temple. Go look at what he did at Baylor. It didn't take very long for the guy to get things going. But you could tell when he got his guys in, when it started going his way, the results changed. Same thing with Kirby Smart. Once he got all of his guys, once it was fully his team and his team alone, he recruited every single person on that roster. They won a national championship. Won a national championship with the 2018 recruiting class. So with that being said, give a coach 3 to 4 years. I get it. Auburn wants to move on from Brian Harsin. Hey, they may have a reason to. Okay, he wasn't their first option, like Dan said. He was maybe a second or third choice. But give the guy a chance. Give the guy a chance. And that's going to bring me to the second hot topic of the day, Dan. And it's in regards to Nebraska and Arizona State. Really, it's a question of which is better. Riding out a season with a lame duck head coach who you know you're going to fire at the end of the year, or firing the coach and riding out the rest of the season with the interim head coach, Dan. Which one's better if there is a better of the two evils?
Again, I think every situation is independent of one another. If you want to call Mark Richt a lame duck coach, then in that example, he was a great leader for the program and a well-respected guy in that room, and he didn't lose the kids, okay? So in that situation, let him finish out the season. But then you also have other situations where a guy is toxic, and he's creating an environment that nobody wants to play in. And in that situation, you have to get rid of him. You have to let him go. And then you also have the guys who, once they know that they're done and they're not going to be coaching anymore, then they kind of mail it in. And in that instance, you got to let them go too. But again, every situation is different, and it all depends on what's actually happening in your locker room. And I think the overall theme here for both questions is the administration, the fan base, and the people who make these decisions, they have to have the pulse of the room. And if they don't, then you can end up doing more harm than good long term. So I think every situation is different. If a guy has got the locker room and he's a great leader for the program and he's not going to damage your long-term product, then you have to allow that guy to finish out the season. But if it's a bad situation where you've got to separate yourself from that person right away, then you do that.
I'm kind of along the same lines here too. I think there's definitely different situations and different ways you need to go about it. To me, I don't know the ins and outs of what was happening at Arizona State or Nebraska, but I do know that Arizona State did have an investigation where Herm Edwards and his staff got in some trouble. There was some controversy brewing all offseason about him and what happened and what transpired over the offseason, and specifically over the dead period the year-long dead period over COVID. There were some recruiting violations they had. I get it. You fired the guy. You gave the guy a chance this season. 3 games in, you fire the guy. Okay. Kind of scandalous. You have your reason. But Nebraska, to me, you have Scott Frost. As far as I know, he didn't lose the locker room. As far as I know, they just didn't play well. They didn't play to their standards, and you let them go. But to me, Dan, either way, if you're up front with recruits with a lame duck head coach, it is going to be harder and harder to recruit kids to come to your university. Same thing with the interim head coach. Because what is the interim head coach preaching to these kids? Does he even have an obligation to recruit? Because he's not. He most likely the interim coach is not going to be there. So I like how Georgia handled it. They let Rick finish out the regular season. Then they decided right after the regular season was over, hey, we're going to let you go, and we're going to let everyone know, and we're going to keep you on to be the head coach for, the interim head coach for your last game of the bowl game. Great. Mark Richt goes and gets another job. And that's where I think Georgia did it better than anyone else. I don't think to me, the timing was perfect for each situation. Obviously, Mark Richt didn't want to leave Georgia. We all know that. Who would? Especially after being as successful as he did. But he got another job after he got let go from Georgia. I think that was the great thing. That how Greg McGarity handled it is he gave Mark Richt a chance to finish out on his own terms and say, okay, I have the choice as to whether or not I get one more game of how I get remembered. And ultimately, he got another job and let Brian McClendon be the interim head coach.
Well, and also I think in that regard, when you're making a change, you're going to lose recruits. You just are. I mean, you may be better long-term, but you have to understand that in most circumstances, when you're making a coaching change, you're probably going to lose a couple guys. So that really can't be part of your decision process because that's probably going to happen anyway. So, you just have to kind of swallow that pill and move on. My rant of the week this week is going to be on something that kind of developed over a conversation that Harrison and I were having, and that is this new world of college football that we're living in. And it comes from conversations, whether it be media, between friends, fan bases, chat rooms, all those things. So many people have, and it's not their fault. It's not their fault. They were conditioned to be this way because college football has been the same for so long that this new world we're living in is so different for everybody. It's hard to wrap your brain around. And one of the lightning rod topics for this would be USC, right? The new world that we're living in with the instant eligibility, the transfer portal, national, name, image, likeness, the movement, the freedom of movement. You have a team that was 4-8 last year, and the conversation keeps coming up. How is this team going to be competing for a national championship the year after being 4-8? Well, you have to get out of the mindset of it's not possible for a 4-8 team to turn it around and be a national power because the game has changed. The rules have changed. The processes have changed. You are allowed to bring in a coach. So we'll use USC for example. They bring in Lincoln Riley, arguably one of the top 5 coaches, top 3 if you listen to some people in college football. Not only does he go to a program that has a history and tradition of winning, which you can get people to come to easily, but you bring in Caleb Williams, who is a Heisman Trophy caliber quarterback. You go out and get a Biletnikoff winning wide receiver. You get a running back who rushed for 1,200 yards last year. You get defensive players, offensive linemen. You're able to completely transform your team in one off season. And so many of those guys were familiar with the way that he plays that you're able to turn it around in 1 year. And we have to get out of the mindset of what we know because we don't know. This is an unprecedented world that we're in now. We've never been here before. So the history that you have in your mind is not applicable to what we're living in now. It's completely different. The world has changed. You have to adjust and adapt, and you have to start using the new parameters that we're living in to form your opinions. And it's going to be like this for a while now, especially until we get a better handle on the movement and stuff like that, of how it's actually going to play out. A team can go from an unsuccessful season one year to a national championship contender the next year. That's just the way it's going to be. It's a new world, and it's not your fault, folks. You've been conditioned for how many ever years you've been alive to understand that college football works a certain way. NFL is different. You have teams that don't make the playoffs the next year all the time. It's always happened that way. But that's not the world we live in college football anymore, because it's more of an NFL style game now. It's a business. And we always knew that. But they've told us now, and that's the world we're in.
Yeah, there's always going to be a new team in the conversation now, and that's the thing now. When you go out there and get a bona fide head coach, someone has proven, and someone who has won, like Lincoln Riley had back at Oklahoma, when you go pull him away, if you're USC, he's going to bring some players with him, especially if he established relationships and was successful at his prior job. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, you looked at the list. If you're watching on YouTube, I brought up the list thanks to 247 Sports, their 2022 college football transfer portal class over at USC. The first name that went over there was quarterback Caleb Williams. First one from OU, if I'm not mistaken, if I scroll all the way back. It was Caleb Williams, the 5-star quarterback from 2 classes before. He was a 1.0 transfer score, according to 247 Sports. Right up next, Mario Williams, one of his top receivers at Ohio State, one of the top weapons, or at Oklahoma, that Caleb Williams had at OU. It's going to bring traction. It's going to bring names. And really, not only is it happening with the transfer portal, but even recruiting, guys. NIL is being used to an extent that we haven't seen, that we didn't think could happen. It is being used. It is borderline being abused. Well, maybe not borderline. It is being abused because it's not being used in the way that many people thought it would. So with that being said, Georgia played football this weekend. It is Tuesday.
Yes, they did.
Yeah. Dan, they absolutely dominated. And I mean dominated South Carolina. I didn't see this type of domination from the very first snap. I didn't see it coming. I thought Georgia would win. I thought they would cover. I think the line was 24.5. Georgia's a pretty good team when it comes to covering the spread. When it comes to, under Kirby Smart, they've not covered only a handful of times. They are 2-1 against the spread so far this year. The one time that they did not cover was a 52-point spread against Samford, which they probably could have covered if they wanted to, especially if they executed in the red zone. We've discussed that already, but Dan, I want to kick it off. Let's get your thoughts on what you saw on Saturday, and let's just get some of your reactions.
Well, I never thought it would be a close game. I said 42-6, and it ended up being, 49-7? Is that right?
I think it was 48.
48.
But,
okay.
Hey,
well,
you're 1 point off.
Like I said, 42-6 is what I thought it would be. I thought they would get a couple field goals. But from the opening drive of the game, South Carolina decided that they wanted the ball first because they wanted to show Georgia they were ready to play, and Georgia shut them down. And then they just proceeded to score. I mean, Stetson Bennett doing Stetson Bennett things. I mean, 284 yards and 2 touchdowns. But he's got a complete control of this offense. And, I thought it was a little bit funny that we were talking about Brock Bowers has gotten off to a slow start to this Georgia season because they didn't really need him in the other game. So many other guys stepped up. Well, here comes Brock Bowers to just put on a freaking show. 5 receptions, 121, and you have 2 touchdowns, but he had 3 touchdowns in the game. So Brock Bowers was amazing, but Georgia's defense, oh my gosh, just flying around. I mean, listen, they get a trash touchdown at the end of the game, and I remember saying to you and to everybody else that I thought Georgia would carry a shutout into 6 games this year into the fourth quarter. And you kind of giggled, and I kind of giggled, and we're like, wow, that's like – I think these late end-of-game touchdown things will probably happen a couple times, but when Georgia's starting defense is on the field, I will not be surprised if they hit that number 6. And, I mean, listen, they're for 3. They've carried a shutout into the fourth quarter on all of the first 3 games. So maybe my number's way off. And if you listen to these prognosticators, I may be terribly off because they're thinking that Georgia's not going to get scored on all year long. But this defense has been absolutely ridiculous. There's so much we can get to on this game. I don't want to take all of the heat, but I was extremely impressed. I think Stetson Bennett's got this offense like way under control, and he is operating like a musician out there. It's just like, oh, you want a little hi hat over here, a little bass drum over here. I'm just ready to go, and I've just been incredibly impressed with the way that this offense has been playing, and that is the one thing that got criticized more than anything else last year was that our offense was just along for the ride. Well, I'm here to tell you this offense is every bit as good as this defense is, and this defense is elite.
They finally put all the pieces together. If you were me and Dan were talking about it before the show, before we went live, Peter Burns came out on SEC this morning on the SEC network with Doring, the Florida wide receiver. I'm blanking on his first name. Chris? I think it's Chris. And said that Georgia, he doesn't see Georgia getting in within one score or any of Georgia's opponents getting within one score of them all season long. And it's because of the fact that Georgia has a good offense and a good defense. This is the most balanced football team I think Kirby Smart has had in his coaching career. In his 7 years that he's been here, there's been no team more balanced. I know last year you had a elite, historic defense, more than elite. They are the next tier up. Historic defense. And there's some valid criticisms of Georgia's offense last year. They weren't that consistent as they needed to be in some points and sometimes. But I think that's different this year. The defense, it's elite again. It's much younger, much more inexperienced. But they aren't carrying, quote unquote, carrying the offense through 15 games. Hell no. It's not happening. The offense, I mean, right now, Dan, we've punted. I think Georgia's punted maybe 2 or 3 times through 3 games that I remember. They punted against Oregon once. I don't think they punted against Samford, if I remember correctly. And they punted, I think, maybe once against South Carolina.
I think twice.
Twice?
Brett Thorson, weapon, by the way.
He had one shank, which I think he
still went 40 yards. Still went 40 yards.
Which, is definitely good for an Aussie punter who's playing his first time playing organized American football, mind you, and then comes back the next punt and just absolutely bombs it. I mean, absolutely insane. He is a weapon, as Dan says, but Georgia's offense is probably going to be one of, if not the best in the country, because you go on and you watch the tape, you don't even need the All-22. Shout out Brooks Austin over at www.patreon.com/Brooks Austin if you want to get some All-22 breakdown. If you go watch the TV copy, guys, just watch how defenses try and play Georgia. It's impossible at this point.
No, and Jonathan Williams has a great question, and I've seen this in many different places. Is Georgia better this year than they were last year? While it seems almost blasphemous to say that a team is better than a national championship team, especially when we haven't won one in 40 years. It's a little bit arrogant maybe, but I think you can make that argument. And do I believe that everybody on this defense, position by position, is more talented than the guys who left? I don't think it's fair to say that, especially not this early in the season. But as a collective unit, they are playing every bit as good on that defense. This offense this year is far and away better than the offense that we had last year. Do we have George Pickens anymore? No, we don't. And that's unfortunate because he's such a great player. But we have other guys, and we are using those weapons better. And Monken is really taking this offense to another level. And it's really like kind of what we talked about in the preseason, where I really felt like Kirby was starting to allow him to have free reign with his offense because he trusted him more. And whether that was just my opinion, and there's no way to prove that or not, Kirby will never say one way or another. But I think it's extremely important to note that he is running things that we haven't seen before. And then if that is the case, if he's allowed to do things that we haven't been doing before, then I think you have to make the argument that Kirby is allowing him to do more. Because I don't think Monken would just sit on his hands and just not run plays because he didn't want to. That, like he told you in this press conference, he said, if it was up to me, I'd throw in every single play, but I know we can't do that. Well, he is thrown. We are a throw-first offense, and this is something that recruits have said we aren't. This is what coaches have said we aren't. He is allowed to do that. So if the question is Georgia better than last year? I think the argument, at least early in the season until we're proven otherwise, is they absolutely are, because the offense is much better and a much bigger portion of this team. Is the defense better player by player? Like I said, I don't think that they necessarily are, but as a collective group, They are playing great. And like Brooks Austin said, they're playing faster. And that is a scary thing for offenses across the country.
Yeah, it's really going to be interesting to see how this defense improves because it's, kind of the talking point of all the haters or the people that want to discredit what Georgia's doing by saying, yeah, they're playing all these cupcake teams. Well, I mean, yeah, Samford's not that great of an opponent for a national championship contending program, but you also have to remember that Georgia played Oregon. In Oregon, they slaughtered Oregon. And Oregon turns around and beats BYU convincingly. BYU made Bo Nix look pretty dang good. And that's not a slight to Bo Nix. Bo Nix has not played well against Georgia, maybe other than one time. And that was his freshman year. Then Georgia got his number. Georgia still won the game freshman year, but they had his number and they didn't lose it through the 4 years that they played him. So Oregon, not a cupcake. I don't think South Carolina is as good as some South Carolina fans think they are. They're a decent program. Historically, they are a decent program, respectable program, and they're a respectable opponent. Everyone needs to remember that when Georgia plays a program, they're not going to look that good compared to when that program turns around and plays somebody else. Georgia's going to make you look bad while also making them look unbeatable. And to bring this point up, Dan, you said they're playing faster. Brooks Austin said it multiple times. They're playing faster, which is true. And Kirby Smart, brings up in press conferences all the time. They don't have the talent. They don't have 5 or 4 first-round picks in the front 7. They don't have 5 first-round picks on defense right now. They don't have that. They may have it in the next 2 or 3 drafts, as in combined, when you take this coming year's draft, the next draft after that, you may get 5 first rounds. But I don't think they have that right now. I think Jalen Carter is the only one that is a consensus first-round pick on this Georgia defense. Kelee Ringo is probably there too right now, but we'll see how he plays for this year. So far, he's been great. So you got 2 consensus first-round picks. You may have some others. At the end of this year, if Nolan Smith keeps playing the way he is, Nolan Smith may get in that conversation.
I think Nolan Smith will test well, and I think he'll – and that's the thing, that the stats are not going to project these guys into the first round, but the way they test at the combine and then the history of the recent draft picks and how well they're playing in the NFL level is going to get some of these guys who maybe in our minds right now wouldn't be first-round draft picks, but that's how they get into the first round. And you had a great quote by Kent Lewis, and forgive me for reading. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the greatest collection of talent that has ever been assembled on a football team because of the work that Coach Smart, his staff, and the tireless, relentless effort they put into building a program is an elite level. And I've heard it put it other ways, that every single year Kirby Smart is growing out and recruiting a high school All-American team and then putting the dog in their chest. And it is. The way that Kirby Smart has elevated the talent at the University of Georgia. Now, listen, when Donovan was here, we had elite talent. We absolutely did. We just didn't win to the level we probably should have. Mark Richt had elite talent while he was here, and for whatever reason, we couldn't get over the hump. But Kirby Smart, not only has he gone out and gotten elite talent, but he's coached them up. And it's not just Kirby. We always say Kirby, and I'm as guilty as anybody. This staff has brought in elite talent and coached them up to play at an elite level. And the amount of buy-in from these players is what we saw at Alabama. Alabama would bring on 5-star on top of 5-star on top of 5-star, and some of these guys didn't get to play until their last year. But the buy-in was there. The work was there. They put in the work when nobody else was watching, and when it was their opportunity to play, they played at a high level. Well, that's what we're seeing at Georgia now. Georgia has elite guys up and down their roster, and they are waiting for their opportunity. And once they get that opportunity, they're making the most of it, and they are playing at an elite level. The formula is out there for everybody to see. It's just that nobody else is willing to work as hard as they're willing to work. I mean, Alabama, Ohio State, probably you have to couple those 3 together. I think those 3 groups bring in elite talent like nobody else does. Now, Texas A&M obviously had the number 1 recruiting class last year. We'll see if they can duplicate that. My short answer would be no. I don't think they can. Do I think they're going to get the level of coaching at Texas A&M that they're getting at Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgia? No, I don't think so. So it's almost sad because that class, in my opinion, will be wasted. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. And if I am, I'm sure somebody will clip this and be like, haha, you're wrong. Well, I just don't see it happening. I see the relentless work that this Georgia staff puts in every single day, and nothing is good enough. And that is the one thing that I think anybody can gather from watching the press conferences and watching the way the players talk is even when they play a fantastic football game, that's not the end all be all. They've got to get better. They've got to get better. And that is a scary, scary thought for the other teams in college football that Georgia's playing at the level they are and they expect to get better.
Now, here's the big question, because I think a lot of people, we talk about how great they've recruited over the last 6 to 7 years and how many talented recruiting classes they've brought in. Now with NIL, there's obviously some worry, some concern, maybe some disgruntlement as to how slow it's been so far through the fall. So it's really going to be interesting to see, can Georgia keep this pace? Because if you go talk to somebody who's like a Miami fan, a Texas fan, some fallen power that is now being revitalized by this new age of NIL, Dan, that we talked about during your rant, they said the playing field is level now. The playing field is level. And that's what they attribute to why a Texas is able to go out and land an Arch Manning after being a 5-7 program or being mediocre for the last 10 years. That is why Miami is able to be on the rise and I think they're a top 10 class at the moment, looking like they may even push the top 4. It is breaking up, I guess, some of the repeat that people talk about when it comes to the top 4 recruiting classes. Where, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, those are 3 teams that will always be in there over the last 6 years. Those are 3 teams you can put in there, just a matter of where. They just shuffle around. Clemson, they're over the last 6 years, they were in there too. They were at number 4, number 5. They were in there somewhere. You had the occasional LSU with a really great class, or, A&M. A&M was I agree with Dan here. I think A&M's a one-hit wonder. They got that great class. I don't think they're going to be able to follow it up because if you go and watch them on Saturdays, their offense, no moss. That offense is not very good. That offense doesn't look entertaining to play in. And what Georgia gets negative recruited about of how they're a run-first offense, A&M should be getting the same heat that Georgia's been getting for the last 10 years. Because by God, Dan, that offense is so, so boring to watch. The most entertaining thing about that game, and I know we're on a tangent here, was their punt game. That punter was good. The best thing, other than their defense, was the damn punter.
Yeah, and Texas A&M, I'm on the record, and it's all over the place, so it's not hard to find. That I just don't think Jimbo's a great coach, and I don't think he develops. And I don't think the kids respect him in the ways that the kids respect the coaches at Alabama and Georgia. And I guess you could throw Ohio State in there. Ryan Day's done a really good job. You're talking about earlier, a coach getting a short leash or a long leash or whatever. Ryan Day came into a situation where he had to win immediately. And I think he's done that. Has he won a national title? No, he hasn't. But I think you would be foolish to say that he's not been an elite coach while he's been there. Now, Jimbo Fisher walks into a national championship situation at Florida State. And then what happens after that? The program goes into the tank. He goes out to Texas A&M, gets a massive contract to be there, almost silly massive contract, right? And what have they done? And I think that is a reflection
of extension too.
Yeah, it's a reflection of coaching. And Texas A&M has so much money that they think the answer is throw money at it, and that's not always the case. Now, is money important? Absolutely it is. And to your point about NIL leveling the playing field, will it take some of the top level recruits away from the top 3? Yes, it will. And we've seen that already. It's happened. But if you can't win and you can't coach these guys up to a level, eventually recruits are going to see that. And then things are going to go back to the way they were. There's always going to be the outlier. Travis Hunter going to Jackson State to go play with Deion Sanders. The guy made a business decision. The guy made it. Yeah. And it's not just a money situation. Obviously that's a big part of it. But he's a defensive back who wants to go play with Deion Sanders. I mean, how can you blame a guy for that? Like, that makes sense. Like, if you're looking at it objectively, it makes sense. Right? Now, Arch Manning going to Texas on the surface doesn't make sense until you hear what he had to say. And he said he wanted to go to a place and be the person responsible for bringing it back to glory. And you have to respect that, whether it's true or not, or I believe what he said was true. I mean, as in, will he be able to do it? I don't know. Case is out, the jury's out on that.
Plus, but, being involved with having the coaching of Steve Sarkisian, who has a track record as a QB developer.
Absolutely. Like, I don't think that was a train wreck decision for Arch Manning, and nothing about that young man in the history of his family would say that they make bad decisions. Would we have loved to see him here at Georgia? Absolutely. That's true. But he made a decision. And like I said, NIL is going to do that. But is Georgia the new Alabama? And we've seen that everywhere. The Georgia's the new Alabama. Harrison, what is your take on the thought process of Georgia is the new Alabama?
I agree with the sense Josh Pate said it this week, said it the other day, that Georgia is doing what Alabama used to do in the prime days of Nick Saban, where at the beginning, starting after that Texas National Championship game, they would go on the road and blow everybody out, no matter who they played. They would blow everybody out of the water and make them look bad. I think that is what Georgia fans are experiencing now. That is what we are seeing in front of our eyes. But am I going to go out and say that they are the next dynasty in college football? No, because it's a thing where when you look back and you say, okay, yeah, that was a dynasty. I think it was Joe Klatt that said, when we look back at the 70s and 90s, heck, I wasn't even alive. Dan was 10 years old in the 80s, probably. Maybe even younger.
Younger.
Yeah, way younger. So, when we look back on that and look back on those changes, if you're living back in the 70s and into the 80s, you weren't saying, oh, look how society's changing. Looking back now, you say, okay, yeah, society changed a lot. And I think that's the approach we need to take with Georgia and whether or not this is the new dynasty. I'm interested to see how NIL shapes things because, with NIL, there's going to be some changes. There's going to be some changes, like Dan said, breaking up where all these top talent, these elite level recruits go. So does that affect Georgia? Does that affect the ability to be in Alabama, or quote unquote Alabama, and establish a dynasty that lasts for over a decade? So right now, to answer your question, no. I think they are on their way to being it. But have they arrived? No. But will Georgia, can a program ever arrive, Dan? I guess this is the question. Can you ever say we have arrived as a program? Maybe Alabama can because they have all those championships. But can you say you've arrived? I mean, is this even measurable?
Well, Texas likes to do it every year. So can a program say it? Absolutely, because Texas says it every year. We're back, baby. No, I think people are being too literal when people say that Georgia is the new Alabama. I think what people are meaning or insinuating is that Georgia has replaced Alabama atop of the mountaintop. And to Roberts from the DGD podcast, Georgia is Georgia. And that is 100% the point that I would like to make, is that when people say that Georgia is the new Alabama, they're not saying Georgia is Alabama. They're saying Georgia has usurped Alabama and taken their place up on top of the mountain. In the moment, that is true. Where I get cautious is because in 1981, after the national championship, Georgia was absolutely loaded. And if you go back and you can just go through the AJC and you can look at old newspapers and articles, and there were articles written that Georgia may never lose again. And Georgia was going to run the SEC for the next 10 or 12 years. And Georgia was the superpower that nobody had ever seen coming. And there was all this hype in all the national papers about University of Georgia in 1981. Now that we've had so many years to look back on it, we understand that Georgia played for the national championship in 1981. They lost to Dan Marino in Pittsburgh. And then it was a gradual decline from that point on. So I am cautiously optimistic about Georgia's ability to stay on top of this mountain. which they are most certainly at the top of at this point. And to argue otherwise is a fool's argument. Georgia is 100% on top of the mountain at this moment. That could change tomorrow. It could change at the end of the season. It could change 10 years from now. You don't know when that change is going to come. To your point, Alabama did have a dynasty. They had top recruiting classes every single year. They either were in the playoffs or on the verge of the playoffs every single year. They won multiple national championships. I think it's hard to crown Georgia this great program when we've got one, because there are plenty of other teams that had one. LSU had probably the greatest team we've ever seen, and that's up for debate. But, I think it's fair to say that's one of the greatest teams we've ever seen win a national title. Auburn won a national title. Clemson won a national title. All these teams are winning one. Florida State won a national title. But they weren't able to sustain it year in and year out. Alabama has been able to do that under Nick Saban. This is an opportunity for Kirby Smart to do that. Georgia has been extremely competitive in 5 of the 6 years that he's been at University of Georgia. They haven't always ended with a national title. So what is your definition of Georgia being on top of that mountain? Is it that we are competing for the national championship every year? If that's the case, I feel safe to say, I feel it's safe to make the assertion that Georgia will be competitive for the national title for the next 4, 5, 6 years. To say that Georgia is going to win multiple national championships in the next 4 or 5 years, I don't know if I'm ready to go there. I think we have the ability to, but there are so many dynamics in today's college football that didn't exist just a couple of years ago that would make that very difficult to prognosticate. So, I think all they're trying to say is that Georgia has risen to the top of the mountain and replaced Alabama. And in the current moment, I believe that to be true.
Absolutely. And I guess, the one thing I wanted to bring up is just go look at Alabama when he had probably one of the greatest staffs of all time, just filled with people on it, just filled with head coaches. Mario Cristobal, Lane Kiffin, Kirby Smart, Dan Lanning, Mel Tucker, we're all on that 2015 staff, the Alabama staff. That was insane. That everyone goes back and says, hey, look what Nick Saban had back in the day. And look what happened afterwards. Look at the effect of Kirby Smart going to Georgia has had on Alabama. They've not been the same, Dan, to me. They've lost some edge, it looks like. They look like they are, go look what they did to Texas at Texas just 2 weeks ago. They were 20-point favorites, and it was a 1-point game. A game they probably should have lost. Using their logic, if Texas had their starting quarterback, they win that game, as they said about their 2 wide receivers. Texas wins the game with that logic. They have not been the same, Dan. It seems every year now, or at least for 2 straight years. We'll see what happens at the end of the year. Last year, they never had a game just in the bag by halftime. Not against a Power 5 program. Everything seemed hard. And right now, to me, it looks like they're going through the same thing again, because we were told for 6 months that Alabama was going to be one of the most dominant teams in college football, that there was going to be nobody that can touch them. And I will raise my hand and say, yes, I believed them, because I looked at the roster. Will Anderson, Bryce Young, 2 of the best players in college football today. Probably 2 that will be in New York. Maybe not Will Anderson, because it's a quarterback's trophy. But we listened to it, Dan. I don't know about you, but I sat there and said, yeah, Georgia's going to have a tough time beating this team because of the fact they have a Heisman Trophy quarterback. They brought in Jahmyr Gibbs, a pretty damn good running back, who looks worse now at Alabama because his offensive line doesn't do very well, Dan. I didn't think I would see that. He does not look as good behind Alabama in Alabama's jerseys, behind an Alabama offensive line, as he did at Georgia Tech.
Well, that's saying a lot. And I think the one thing that has to be noted for this Alabama team is that the biggest difference between when Alabama was running the show is they didn't have anybody that could take the players that they wanted away from them. The one thing that Kirby has done since he's been at University of Georgia is he's gone toe-to-toe with Alabama for these recruits that they typically get. And Kirby is winning a large majority of those. And Alabama doesn't necessarily have the talent advantage that they always had under Nick Saban. Kirby has taken some of that thunder away from him. And now Kirby has kind of replaced him as far as having the most talented roster. To your point about this Alabama team and the amount of talent they brought in, they did. They really did. They went out and got some guys, some real guys. But if you don't have an elite offensive and defensive line, you're going to struggle against other competitive teams. They have Will Anderson. It would be hard and almost foolish to say that anybody else has an edge rusher as good as Will Anderson. In my opinion, I believe he is as ready-made for the NFL as they come. I love Jalen Carter, but I would not say that Jalen Carter is as good as Will Anderson. Not at what Will Anderson does. Jalen Carter, a different player, not necessarily a fair comparison. But Kirby and his staff have taken some of the players that Alabama traditionally get, and they're on their roster now. So Alabama, using common sense, is not going to be as good as they were before. But listen, they're still an elite team, and to say otherwise is foolish. And if you think just because they struggled against Texas, that means that they're not an elite team, that's not true at all. They are an elite team. They're going to beat the brakes off of just about everybody they play. They may have another tough game, but at the end of the day, they were tasked with winning that football game, and they were able to do it. And that's what elite teams do. You may not always play a great game from whistle to whistle, but when it matters most, you have to be able to win the game. Alabama can still do that. In Georgia, they are starting to boat race people, which is awesome to see. But it can also be a detriment to your future because at the end of the year, when your guys are in a battle-tested game, they may not be as prepared as a team like Alabama, who's actually had to fight and scratch and claw to get to a victory. So you have blowout wins in one hand, struggle wins in the other hand. But at the end of the day, it only matters what you do when you're playing on that particular Saturday.
And that's the one thing we all need to remember is Alabama's not going to be the same team from game 1 as they will be in game 12, in game 13, game 14, game 15 if they get there. Same can be said for Georgia. There will be a different team in game 12, game 13, and game on than they were in game 1. They're not going to have one sack for much longer. And it's not a great way to judge Georgia's pass rush because all you got to do is just turn on the tape. You can easily see that Georgia's getting some pass rush. They're getting some pressure. And yes, Dan's facial hair is back after enough pleading, after enough comments about it. He brought it back. So with that being said, make sure to hit the thumbs up button if you like Dan's facial hair. If we get 100 likes in this video, heck, I will start trying to grow a mustache as you all crave. So blow it up, share with everybody. I will grow a mustache if we get 100 likes on this video. Make sure to share it with your friends. Rate us 5 stars on the podcast. Dan, I see you have something to say.
Oh my God. Listen, if for no other, you can hate this podcast, but I would tell all of your friends to share because I want to see Harrison try to grow a mustache. That is going to be hilarious, and that is worth the time to share this and get a like.
Putting it out there. Go ahead and put it in there. Guys, we appreciate you being with us. Rudes, you're excused. I know you were late, but it's okay. You were teaching class after work. Okay, yeah. Rudes, I respect it. Robert, thank you for being one of the most active members in this community. Appreciate you, man. Make sure you go check out the GGG podcast. Guys, it is one of the most elite shows. One of the best shows in the Georgia space. I mean, 2 times a week. I mean, he may be 3 times a week. I don't know how he does it. I'm sure Dan can make it multiple times a week, but I don't know if I can. Robert comes up with topics out of just great topics. Go check him out. He has guests on frequently. Great show. Go check out Class City Sports Podcast tomorrow at 8 p.m. Guys, we appreciate you. We will see you next week, next month. Oh, shoot. Dan, 52-point spread, or I forget what the spread is. I need your prediction for Kent State. I forgot about predictions. I'm bad. Real quick.
Georgia wins. Listen, it's hard to say. This Georgia team is so daggum good. I think saying that Georgia either holds them scoreless or lets them have a field goal is probably a safe bet on that end. But on offense, it's just whatever they want to do. And I'm not being flippant. I'm not being arrogant. I'm just saying it's whatever they want to do. I mean, it could be 52-0. It could be 65-10. I have no. Georgia is going to win. They're going to win comfortably. I don't know what they want to do, and that we saw that in the Samford game, and now I'm nervous to go on the record and say that they're going to cover the spread because I don't know if they want to. Who the heck is Kent State? I got you, bro.
Anyways, I got Georgia. I think it's gonna be another shutout. It should be a shutout. It should be. Now Kent State did play Oklahoma close for about a half. We'll see how that goes. Anyways, guys, that's going to wrap it up today for episode number 58 of the Top Dog Talk podcast. Remember, 100 likes. I'm going to sit here and grow a mustache, and you're going to wait on it, Robert, because you inspired it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Harrison Marino. That's Dan Kylie. We'll see you next Tuesday. Same place, same time. See you next week.